Greetings, salutations, and words of goodwill. Welcome back to another video in my series on early Christian heresies. The heresy that we will be covering today is known as Apollinarianism, and unsurprisingly, this heresy is promulgated by a man by the name of Apollinaris, who, though he was a bishop in Syria, was very much in the Alexandrian school of theology. In fact, he was a friend of St. Athanasius and a staunch defender, unsurprisingly, of the phrase homoousion, which we discussed in the last video that came out of the Council of Nicaea, and in essence condemned Arianism. And in that rejection of Arianism, must be significantly committed, as he should be, to the position that the Father and the Son are both God. And so then, when considering the nature of the incarnation, he has to find a way to say that Jesus is both human and divine at the same time. Now, given that in my last video I was suggesting that I'm not up to the task of even really perfectly defining dog, I'm certainly not going to be able to perfectly define human. However, classically, it has been suggested that if human beings are anything, right, that we do definitely have two significant characteristics, namely that we're animals, which should be evident from the fact that we have bodies and eat and reproduce and move around, and that also we are rational. In other words, that we are things that think. And while I won't be able to defend this position here, traditionally that is also understood to mean that we have an immaterial soul, so that a human being is in some sense a conjunction of an animal body with an immaterial rational soul. And therefore, whereas the body is responsible primarily for our capacity to move and act and be in extended space and in material reality, our soul is responsible for our capacity to think and choose, is the seat or the place where we have our mind and our will. Now, I'm not going to be able to defend that here either. You just have to understand that it's a presupposition of Apollinaris. I think he happens to be right. And once we start analyzing his position, we're going to proceed as though he is correct. I can't defend that in this particular video because it would go so far afield that I'd have to just give the video a different name. And you can understand what it is I've just said without being convinced of it. So you just kind of have to take it that that's the presupposition. Humans exist as things with bodies and souls, and that's essential to what we are. If you're talking about something that doesn't have a soul, and at least shouldn't have a body, then the thing you're talking about isn't human. And that the body is extended in space, responsible for physical movement in the material world, and that the soul is responsible for thought and choice, because it is the mind and the will. And while I did say that I can't defend this position here, I will at the very least go so far as to mention that although Apollinaris prefers the word nous, which is mind in Greek, that the Greek word for what we call soul today is psyche. And if you study psychology, which you are primarily studying is the health of the mind and that which is the seat of behavior, because you also study behavioral abnormalities or deficiencies, and or what it would mean for the behavior to be healthy, and that is, in essence, your will, right? Your capacity to make choices. And so Apollinaris, in attempting to describe the incarnation, has to figure out a way to unite God the Son to an entity which has both a body and a soul, which is the mind and will. And the way Apollinaris does it is he says that when the Son became man, what happened was that the divine mind and will of the Son, who is God, became the mind and will of a humanly shaped body. And so the resultant reality was that there was an entity with a human body, and this entity had a mind and will, and therefore was a animal with a human body and a being with a mind and will, and the conjunction of a human animal body with a mind and will in a single entity we've already established is a human. And therefore, Christ's divine mind and will substitutes for what would normally be a created mind and will in human beings which were not also God, right? And so, yes, Christ's mind and will is a little bit different than a created mind and will that a normal human being has, but, it's Jesus, okay? So deal with it. And of course, you can see the Alexandrian tendency here, because what is being superemphasized is Christ's divinity, his divine mind and will. And what is being sacrificed is any idea that he has a created mind and will, which would be, as it were, a human mind and will. And of course, Arius's position was probably very similar, but what he is suggesting is that Christ's mind and will was already created because Christ is completely a creature and not really God. And so essentially what Apollinaris is saying is, well, if he is really God, then his mind and will must be God's mind and will because he's God. Now, this position is condemned at the First Council of Constantinople in 381, which is the Second Ecumenical Council. And the position that that council takes, in contradiction to Apollinaris, is that Jesus, in fact, has two minds and two wills. He has a divine mind and will, and he has a human mind and will. Though, as will become relevant later, the position regarding the will is sort of implicit in the position regarding the mind and less explicitly stated. Now, that would be sufficient to express the nature of the heresy, and it could be a place to stop the video. However, before ending it, I wanted to make two other considerations regarding this heresy. The first is to explain the soteriological reasons why it needs to be condemned. And the second is to consider the implications that the position which the Church takes ultimately has concerning human beings, concerning anthropology, concerning what it is that we in fact are. Now, the soteriological problem that this position has, that is in essence the reason that it gets condemned, is precisely the same problem that Docetism has. If there's some aspect of human beings that isn't assumed by Jesus, then there is some aspect of human beings that isn't saved. Okay? So if Jesus does not take on a human mind and will, or in other words, a human soul, and only takes on a human body, then only the human body is saved from sin, and the human soul is not saved from sin. And I hope that everyone listening to this can realize precisely how ridiculous of a position that would be. I mean, I could think of ways to defend it, but that's a rabbit hole. So if Jesus doesn't have a human soul, then the human soul in us is not saved, and consequently, we're probably going to hell. But see, that's the way it's normally presented, but the problem is that Apollinaris really thinks that Jesus does have a human soul, right? Because he has a soul which is conjoined to a human body. And is that not a human soul? And that brings us to the second consideration before completing the video, that the Church's answer seems to be no. And this in and of itself is very interesting with respect to what it is that human beings are. Yes, we consist of these two parts, you might say, right? A body and a soul, an aspect which is responsible for activity and extension in matter and physical space, and a part which is responsible for thought and choice. But the type of soul that the human being has, and consequently the type of mind, and you might even probably suggest will, that a human being has, is somehow appropriate to existence in a body, such that we think and choose in an embodied manner. And so we are, in that sense, not just different from God, which you would expect because, we're not God, but different from angels, right? Different from things which would think without a body, that somehow our capacity for thought and choice is intricately connected to the fact that we are material beings, and it's appropriate to our state as material beings. And so any notion someone might have of being able to escape one's body, right, to have one's soul exist independent of one's body and have that be a good thing, is kind of like thinking that you can escape your right leg, right? Maybe it's got gangrene and it needs to be amputated, but you'd hardly consider that an escape, right? Now you must exist for the rest of your life without a right leg, and that's a bad thing. We are not the sort of creatures that will ever feel comfortable as incorporeal spirits, because even if we have the capacity to exist without our body after death, we remain corporeal spirits, simply lacking that aspect of us that is corporeal. Just like if you cut off my right leg, I remain an entity which is supposed to be right-legged, and I lack it, and that will create problems for me. And so the human body and the human soul are deeply interconnected, such that the human soul is appropriate to the body which it ensouls. And it cannot be any other way. And that has significant implications for soteriology, that is salvation, as we've already sort of suggested, with the soul not being able to escape the body, but also for the sacraments, epistemology, ethics, even the nature of gender. But this really isn't the time and place to go into those now. So we'll call it a day. Thank you for listening. Like always, please go ahead and subscribe, comment. Tell me if you think I'm doing something wrong, could do something better, made a mistake in anything I said. There's a lot more angles at which to look at Apollinarianism, and I don't have time to look at all of them, so obviously I am aware of that. And until next time, God bless and have a great day.